Hey, writers. I am so happy to have Sam Cameron here with me today. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, let me introduce, I know you already, but the writers here may not know you, and I'd love to tell them more about what you're doing. So Sam is a high school history teacher, a YA author, and an Author Accelerator certified book coach specializing in books for children. She is the creator of the Substack Truant Pen, which is a great Substack, by the way,
Thank you.
a newsletter offering practical advice to stuck writers. Sam currently serves as the critique group coordinator for the Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia chapter of the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, which we all commonly refer to as the SCBWI. And I am really happy to have Sam here with us today because she offers this amazing perspective in that she is writing YA and editing YA, but she also is surrounded by the audience for YA since she is a high school teacher. So we are going to pick Sam's brain here on all the things YA. And I also did want to mention that Sam has this tremendous article on the Jane Friedman blog, which we'll put a link to here in the show notes too, that will be a great resource for everybody who's interested in writing YA because it kind of points to some of these topics that we're going to talk about here. But let's maybe get a more holistic view here of the YA market. It's kind of a new market, really, all things considered in
Yeah.
publishing. I mean, it hasn't been around all that long. So, and yet some things have remained the same as it's developed into this thing that it's become. So I guess maybe let's start with what do you think are some universal themes that we commonly see in YA books?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And when I think about YA, what I'm writing, but also what I am guiding other YA writers towards, I like to think about the audience and really center the needs of that YA audience, right? So who is the YA audience? Um, Sometimes it's actually adults, right? There are a lot of adults who do enjoy reading young adults. I just want to put that out there. There's nothing wrong
Yep.
with being an adult who likes to read YA. But who it is generally intended for is teenagers. So people kind of ranging from about 12 or 13 years old, sometimes as young as 11, up through 17, 18, 19 years old, maybe even 20 years old. And some of those older teens are probably also reading books for adults, just like adults might
Yep.
also be reading young adult. Um, and so I think that anytime you're sitting down to write a book and you're thinking about your audience, it's important to think about what sort of stage of life is my audience in? What are the things, where are they hurting? What are they thinking about? What are they wondering about? And the topics that you write about for that kind of audience is going to be informed by where they are in their lives. So if we think about where teenagers are kind of developmentally, um, a really important phase of life they're in is they're becoming more autonomous, right? That is the whole phase of life when you are becoming increasingly separated from your parents, you're becoming increasingly independent. And so a lot of teens are really attracted to books where they get to see themselves front and center and in the driver's seat. So there used to be a very funny Twitter account called "Where Are These Children's Parents?" Um, and it was basically like summarizing the plots of middle grade and YA books
Yeah.
where the kids were doing all these ridiculous things. It's like, where are the adults in this world? Why aren't they doing this? So of course there are like YA plots we can laugh about because they're a little bit, you know, it may be a little bit silly, or you know, you may have the teenagers or the kids taking on more than most kids probably would, but that's part of the appeal. Is that some of your audience may not have quite that level of autonomy, and they're looking for a chance to kind of experience it.
Yeah.
The other really big sort of developmental place where teenagers are is identity formation. So not just autonomy, but figuring out, who am I, what do I like, what's important about my identity, who do I fit in with, where's my community. And so the types of themes that I think you see from the beginning of the genre up through now, and really any, like, even if you look at like Catcher in the Rye, which,
Yeah.
you know, has a teenage protagonist, uh, themes about friendship and love, right? Belonging, sense of place, sense of purpose. I also think that a lot of kids of any age have a really strong sense of fairness and right and wrong. And teenagers in particular, especially like as they get older, are starting to realize that there's more moral complexity in the world, that there's more shades of gray. And so I think teenagers are really attracted to, especially older teenagers, so you're like upper YA, are attracted to shades of gray, moral complexity, hypocrisy and lies, right and wrong. Obviously, rebellion is a really popular theme in YA. So those are the types of themes that I think you see across YA, across time, and that I think will just always be relevant for a teenage audience.
Yeah. Yeah. So since you have this extra pulse here of maybe what kids are reading now, what kinds of themes are you seeing in, whether it's like the books that you see your students reading or just in the market? What kind of themes?
So some newer themes. So across the children's book universe, there's an increased push for diverse representations of marginalized characters. And I would say teenagers in particular are very drawn to that. And part of the reason, one, is a strong sense of social justice that a lot of teenagers have. Also, especially teenagers who want to see themselves reflected are going to be drawn to the teenagers who look like them or have experiences like them. But also teenagers are very curious about each other. And so you do have teens who are interested in reading about, people that are not like them, and that maybe they've never met anyone who's like that. And they're curious about them. So definitely diverse representation is big in YA. Things to do with like places or cultures that are not frequently represented. Climate change, something that kids are thinking about, social justice, like, so those themes are a little more prevalent. The other thing that is very interesting to me is, so I was actually having a discussion with some of my teaching colleagues about this. So we were talking about the fact that all of the data indicates that teenagers are doing fewer drugs, drinking less alcohol, and having sex later, like delaying the first age of sexual experience. And interestingly, YA books are much more sex positive, I think, than they used to be.
Interesting.
Like you see, it's not like super graphic or anything in a YA book. Anything super graphic would get pushed to an adult market. But there's a lot more like sex on the page, teenagers having sex in books, and that it's sex positive in the sense that there's not a lot of, it's like, we're being safe, we're using consent, this is a good thing, nothing bad happens as a result. And that used to be very rare, I feel like. And so that's newer. And I'm kind of curious about if, what the relationship is between, if kids are seeing this in their media more, that actually it makes it like feel like less they need to explore in real life. I'm not really sure that connection, but I would say a new trend is more sex positive, a lot more LGBTQ themes, more sex positive LGBTQ books. And then the other big trend is just more sort of open representation of like mental health struggles. So anxiety and depression in particular are two really big ones that a lot of our teens are struggling with. And so they're interested in seeing candid representations of what it's like to live with anxiety and depression on the page.
Yeah, I think that the mental health one is even true in the adult market. I don't think the adult market has quite caught up in some other ways, but the mental health aspect seems to be across more markets in general, which is a good thing. You had mentioned that some adults like to read YA, and not just those of us who are writing or trying to stay current with this market. I mean, there's adult readers who really enjoy the YA market too. And yet we know that sometimes YA can get sort of looked down upon, it's not serious literature. Do with that what you will. And so I don't know, sometimes there's a stigma for people who either want to read in this market or write for this market. And I think some of that is because like critics of the market will be like, everything's over the top. These teenagers are like, oh, woe is me because,
Yeah.
you know, I got a pimple on my forehead or something. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about kind of this stigma around YA.
Yes. Yes, I have a lot of thoughts. So I have several things that I'll say about this. So one, first thing I'll point out is that you can read adult novels that have a lot of angst and moodiness and high emotions too. And you can read YA novels that are not angsty at all, or have like a lower level of emotion. So I think part of that just depends on the subgenre within YA. So I think a lot of the really famous YA novels, or the ones that get like big movie adaptations or Netflix shows made out of them, tend to be fantasy and science fiction, which are a more angsty genre, right? Or dramas, which are more angsty. But if you think about something like Heartstopper, which has also been adapted into a big Netflix show, like there's some serious things in there. There's some serious like mental illness, relationship, questioning queer identity, stuff. It's not angsty. Like I wouldn't say it's a very angsty. I mean, the emotions are very high, because of the age of the protagonist and what they're going through, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily angsty. So that's one thing I would say, is that it kind of depends on the genre within YA, that you can find very angsty YA, but you can also find like very angsty adult sci-fi and fantasy, and very not angsty or like low angsty young adult. The other thing that I kind of feel like is important to talk about in here is that the extent to which there is angst and very high emotion is intentional, because of the needs of the audience and what is trying to be represented for the audience. So teenagers have very fascinating brains. They do not function the way that adult brains work. So if you have a teenager at home and you're ever like, what were you thinking? It is because their brain does not work the same way that your brain does. And you might not remember what it felt like to have a teenage brain. So one of the very interesting things about teenage brains is that they have compared to adults, and younger children, they have a lower baseline level of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And dopamine is the neurotransmitter that gives you like a little dose of good feelings when you do something that is essential for your survival. So you eat carbohydrates, yay, dopamine, yes, do more of this will help you survive. You make a social connection, right? Yes, do more of this is helpful for survival. So we all have like an amount of dopamine in our brains regardless of what we're doing, and then we get these little hits when we do something that we need to do to survive. So teenagers, for whatever reason, probably because of all the other amazing development that's happening in their brains, because they're basically toddlers. Like they're going through the same amount of development that a toddler is going through, just in a much bigger body. And so their brain's going through all this development. And part of that is that temporarily for a few years, their dopamine level drops. As a result, everything feels extremely boring to teenagers. So if you have a teenager who used to really love doing something and they've lost interest in that, sometimes it's because they're changing and finding new interests, and sometimes it's just because like they really need a lot more stimulation than they used to. So things feel really boring to them. They need a lot of stimulation, but also when they have an emotion, it feels much more powerful than an adult emotion, especially like a new emotion like romantic love, which a lot of kids, the kids who experience romantic love, probably never experienced it until they were in their teens. And so the reason behind the like really high emotions in YA novels is because, one, that's kind of what it feels like to be a teenager. Is for a lot of teenagers, you have these emotions that feel so much more intense. But it also is appealing potentially to that teenage audience to have that intense emotion, like have the ability to vicariously experience that intense emotion on the page, right? So they may not, they don't have a whole lot of outlets for their rage. I mean, they yell at their parents, right? Or they might do other stuff, but to be able to read a novel where, the hero is like throwing stuff and punching things and like leading the rebellion, like that can be very cathartic for them to get to do that. So that's another kind of element of this. And then the final thing that I'll say about this is, in terms of, is YA lesser because it has this really high emotion? Think about it this way. YA novels, one, you have to get across really deep emotions, which are hard to write. You have to get across a complicated story because you're talking to people who have the cognitive complexity of an adult, and can handle all of, in fact, can probably handle more because they have these incredible memories, right? So they can handle a lot of information. They're very curious. They like twists. They like surprises. And they have the most sensitive BS detectors in the world, right? So you have to, and they have tons of other stuff to do. So you have to capture their interest really quickly, and hold it, because there's so many other things they could be doing. So you have to deliver all of that, and with a lower word count than what an adult writer gets to do. Writing for YA is actually really hard, right? Yeah. Even though it's sort of looked down upon as, I would say it's the same with romance. Like romance is looked down upon as like this lesser, like, oh, it's so cutesy and it's stupid and whatever. It's not stupid. And also it's really hard. It's really hard to write a compelling romance. So if you ever feel like, you are, you're writing YA and it's like, oh, like what? It's just a silly little story for teens. Like, one, it can be life-changing for those kids who read it. Two, it's really hard. It's hard to write a good one. And sometimes I'm actually one of those adults who really likes to read YA. And part of it I've realized is I really like fantasy and science fiction, but when I read fantasy and science fiction for adults, it's like, wow, there's so much detail that I just do not need to know. And I just do not have the energy or interest in. If I read a YA one, there's going to be less of that, right? I'll still have enough to get the, very immersive world building, but not all of the like extra.
I'm so glad you said that, because I feel the same way. I'm like, I enjoy speculative fiction for the under 18 crowd. And then my husband really enjoys reading like a lot of fantasy and whatnot for adults, but I'm like, I just can't.
It's too long.
I'm so lost.
Long. It is too long. It is too detailed.
That's funny. Okay, so we know that we got to keep the reader engaged. How do we do this?
Yes, great question. So I would say this is something that goes across genre, is to create a character, to create an emotional investment in your main character, or main characters if you have multiple. Because again, if we think about why it is that readers are compelled by novels, right? What we're looking for is the ability to sort of slide into somebody else's experience, slide into somebody else's life for however long we're in this book. And so I think the key to like a really successful novel of any genre for any age group, is conveying, like having on the page the emotional experience, right? Giving the ability to your reader to inhabit the feelings and the internal processing of the characters. So a common thing, I'm sure you've seen this too, Sarah, with some of the writers that you coach, that it's so common because of the whole like show don't tell advice, to see writers treating their novels as if your narrator is a camera, right, on a movie or TV show, right? And so you're pointing the camera at all sorts of external things, and not allowing the reader into the skin and into the experience of the narrator or the main character. And that's missing out on what a novel can do that a movie or television show can't do, right? Which is to get you into that emotional investment. So you could have all of the rebellions and all of the explosions and all of the action and adventure, and if it is not about a person that your teenage reader is invested in, they're not going to be interested, right, in all of that. I would say you can kind of see the flip, the reverse is true also, right? You can have a book where not a lot happens, right? That it's kind of slow or cozy, or any of those words we might use, where there's not a super complicated plot, there's not very high stakes, and yet there's characters who the reader can emotionally invest in because the reader can emotionally connect to them and has a sense of while I'm reading this book, I am inhabiting the life of this person. And that's what's going to hook your reader and engage your reader.
Excellent. So you're telling me that I don't need to write a friendship story in which we are off on a heist and then we're going to do a highway robbery chase scene, move from one thing to the next. We can still capture people's attention.
Yes, absolutely. So I can think of a couple of examples of books like that where there's not like a you know, and some of it has to do with genre too, right? Because you're going to have some kids who like I know when I was a teenager, I was not interested in anything contemporary or realistic, no matter how well written they were, because I just liked fantasy and science fiction better. But now it's like I can appreciate the craft of a really well done contemporary YA. And I think there's a lot of kids out there who like that genre and would read it. So you could write a really great example of a friendship story is Darius the Great is Not Okay. Fantastic book, really good book. You know, it's exciting in the sense that the main action of the story takes place in Iran. Darius, it goes with his parents to Iran for the first time to meet his mother's parents, who he's never met in person, and he befriends a boy who is his grandparents' neighbor. And yet, it's not really about like, here is the whole Iranian political landscape and, you know, all of the rebellions and political dissent. That's not what it's about, right? It's really this very intimate story about Darius, his relationship with his dad, his relationship with the rest of his family, and then this friendship that he develops. And there's lots of books out there that are like that.
And your mental health. That
and your mental health, right? And he's gay, so it's all of
so it includes a lot of different aspects. But well, this is just fantastic. This has been a fabulous conversation, and I knew it would be because Sam is very smart about all the things in YA, and I want to make sure that our writers can connect with you. So you have a website, you have the Substack, but you also have a website where you connect with people that way, because you also are a book coach. So maybe do you want to talk about that just a minute here?
Yes. So so my company is called Truant Pen, which, let me spell that out loud for you guys. So that is TruantPen.com, like you're playing truant from school, since I'm, you know, a teacher. It's actually a reference to a Philip Sidney poem. He has writer's block, and he says, biting my truant pen, beating for myself for spite. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. So that's where it comes from.
Super fun.
So I really specialize not only in YA, but specifically writing LGBTQ characters for kids. So if you go onto my website and you go to truantpen.com/LGBTQ, there is a free quiz that you can take to see how LGBTQ inclusive your manuscript is.
Fabulous. That's amazing. Okay, so writers, I hope that you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. And Sam, I just want to thank you again for your time and for sharing your insight and expertise.
Thank you so much. I had a great time. I hope to hear from you all.
All right, fabulous. Writers, we will see you next time. Bye.